And I'm back. Streaming. And I'm going to start trying to breathe, like actually breathe. All right. So for streaming, the problem is, of course, that corporations do not understand creative culture. You know, the most amazing, one of the most beautiful things that you can do is be in the presence of artists, musicians, painters, writers, and see they possess a level of generosity and desire to create, to raise the level of the form. Yeah, there's a lot of pettiness and jealousy and all that other stuff, but there's also that thing in them that, because they understand what it is like to start with something that doesn't exist, and out of that nothing create beauty. There is a certain amount of respect for even engaging in the work, and there's tremendous respect for the art forms in which they inhabit. Okay. And so there's a lot of sharing that we do back and forth. Corporations don't know how to do that. The only thing they understand is ownership. And while it is, there was a time when writers would use characters from other books in their novels. So, like, Sherlock Holmes made I might be wrong there about that, but I don't think I am. Made appearances in books by other writers, and it wasn't a big deal. Other characters from other books made appearances in Doyle's work, and it wasn't a big deal. It was just sort of understood that you were creating something. You inhabited an ecosystem that you all fed into. And that's the way that artists think. Corporations, they're not people, and the only thing they really know how to do, those who are at the heads of them, is own things. So when Netflix became what it became, when it became a short-term, I want to say threat, but if anyone had been engaging in anything like critical thinking at the time, they would have seen it as an opportunity. So I don't even want to call it a threat. Netflix came about and scared the bejesus out of all of traditional media. And they decided to make it their mission, some of them, to make it as difficult as possible for Netflix to get hold of any licensing for their stuff. For instance, famously, Game of Thrones refused to license. HBO refused to license Game of Thrones to Netflix. And when Netflix first went streaming, you could watch Star Trek, I think. You could watch Cabot Cove. You could watch Murder, She Wrote. You could watch Quincy. You could watch, what's the other one I'm thinking of? Columbo for a while. And even for a while, you could watch Law and Order. You could watch the properties that these organizations no longer cared about or figured that Netflix wasn't going to make all that much money on anyway. But then it turned out that people were into the nostalgia. I totally rewatched Murder, She Wrote, and I rewatched Quincy, and I rewatched Columbo on Netflix when it started streaming. And so the mission became to cripple Netflix, to destroy Netflix. Instead, we didn't have to be where we are now. We just didn't. If the people who were in charge were not corporatized and short-term corporatized short-term thinkers, because all that the corporate types care about is the bottom line for the time period for which they are in charge. The whole thing can fall to pieces as far as they're concerned once they move on, but while they're in charge, they want to look good, right? And so by all means, make sure that Netflix doesn't get hold of any really good properties or any hot properties, if at all possible, because they're scaring us. And this could have been like just the most reasonable ecosystem by which it became cheaper to internationalize American television shows, by which networks could have used Netflix as a way of as a like a proving ground to test out exciting experimental material to see if it was going to have an audience, and do that a little bit more cheaply. But they chose not to do that. They chose instead to block them at every turn. And of course, because Netflix is a corporation too, and corporations are notoriously headed by men who get in their feelings when stuff like this happens and stop thinking about the ecosystem and start thinking about their own egos. And so they rolled out $100 million for House of Cards and said, hey, look, if you won't give us great Game of Thrones, we'll create our own prestige piece, and then you'll be sorry. And so now nobody's working with anybody. Everybody could have been making money. Everybody could have been making good art. But instead, we have this. We have 1,000 streaming services. And frankly, the traditional networks, they don't have a need for them. They don't have a need for streaming services, and they're not doing them any good because, as you can see, they're not making any money. They could have just let Netflix go on, make their money, use their connections with them to extend the life of certain of products that they no longer believed in, or to even, because in the UK they bring back shows all the time, so they'll like cancel a show and then bring it back 10 years later or 2 years later. They could have used Netflix for that. They could have used Netflix to, instead of like starting to do, doing these like short seasons with that run on their television stations, they could have. I've not slept, and so I'm not thinking super clearly. But hopefully you can take what I'm saying and run with it and get a sense of the possibility that existed had people been willing to make deals rather than war. And so now, predictably, in the most predictable problem ever, or one of, Hollywood is on fire. Because we've got 1,000 streaming services, and you can't afford to pay. If you would stop paying the people who've been making the terrible decisions that got us here quite so much money, you could totally afford to pay everybody. But there was a possibility that they didn't have to give up their big fat checks, and everybody still could have been making money. And those are my thoughts at the moment, and I think I'm done for now, and I don't think I'm going to sleep yet, but hopefully I've said enough to slow my brain down a little while the medication kicks in. Anyway,